Welcome to this presentation on the interaction of traceability and sustainability in fashion, given as part of EU Green Week 2023. My name is Richard Wielachowski, and I will be presenting today. I'm the Senior Analyst at the Textile Programme at Planet Tracker. The presentation will take maybe about 15 to 20 minutes. Should you want a copy of the slides or you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me after the presentation. My email is shown on the slide there. It's richard@planet-tracker.org. Always happy to continue the conversation in this area. Now, before we jump into the meat of the presentation, just a quick overview of Planet Tracker. Planet Tracker is a non-profit sustainable finance think tank focused on aligning capital markets with planetary boundaries. Our research and engagement seeks to highlight the major risks to investors from not incorporating natural capital in their valuation metrics. We currently have teams covering plastics, textiles, oceans, and food and land use. You can find our website at www.planet-tracker.org. The work that I'm going to present today and talk about is based on a report we've already published called Lifting the Rug. All our work is freely available on our website, so I encourage you to visit our website and download anything that you find interesting. So today I'm going to talk about traceability and sustainability and how we see that as a critical element for driving sustainable change in the apparel industry. However, let's start by briefly addressing the problems that we face. Frankly, we consume a lot of textiles. This is data for the EU, and in 2020, citizens bought something around 6.6 million tons of clothing and footwear. That equates to around 6 kilograms of clothing and around 3 kilograms of footwear per capita. Now, up to 50% of that clothes in people's wardrobes are not actually being used for at least a year, and every year about 30% of the clothes produced are never sold. So we're consuming a lot. We're not using the clothing we do buy in a very responsible fashion, and the amount of clothing we're buying is increasing. It's increased by around 40% between 1996 and 2012, and the trend is that it's increased since then, I would say, and that has been built in part on both prices becoming easier and easier to afford. Between 1996 and 2018, clothing prices in the EU fell by more than 30%. Relative to inflation. So although as people's consumption of clothing has gone up, it hasn't risen necessarily as a percentage of their overall spending, making clothing more and more of a disposable good. Now, unsurprisingly, a big amount of consumption comes with a big environmental footprint. Textiles are estimated to be around 4 to 6% of the EU's environmental footprint. And 80% of that negative environmental impact is associated with the manufacturing phase. Examples of those significant impacts include land use, obviously growing crops, for instance, cotton, water use, and greenhouse gas emissions. Now, 80 to 90% of the negative environmental impact occurs not in the EU, but actually occurs abroad, typically in the global south, where we see a large amount of textile manufacturing occurring. Now, closer to home, the use phase of textiles is associated with the production of toxins from washing, the detergents that we use, along with the release of microfibers, both natural and synthetic, and microplastic release. And given increasing scientific evidence of the negative impact of microfibers and microplastics on both ecosystems and the life organisms living within them, that be seabed, sea crustacea, birds, even humanity, I think this is increasingly an area that people are going to be focused on. When we cut to the end of life, textiles are also associated with a significant problem of waste. Between 25 and 50% of clothes collected in the EU are considered to be in such bad shape they cannot be resold and are sent for recycling or to incineration and landfill. And frankly, at the moment, a lot of that is going to be exported to the global south. We see huge problems in countries like Ghana with a lot of our textile waste being exported to these countries where it can't necessarily be managed properly and ends up released into the environment. So we have an industry today that is really a long way away from sustainability. We need to move away from that structure, that linear, extractive, take, make, and dispose economy instead prioritize a more sustainable circular system. We need to remove highly toxic chemicals from the production process and minimize the use of water. The water that is used needs to be treated when it is used to make sure that we don't see chemicals leaching into the environment. There needs to be a concerted move to reduce the use of synthetic fibers and instead look to the scaling of next generation natural-based fibers. However, these changes need to be made with a firm eye on a just transition. This is an industry which, as I mentioned earlier, has a lot of manufacturing in the global south. We can't expect, or we shouldn't expect a sustainable change to come on the back of the wages and the lifestyle livelihoods of workers who are working in the garment industry today. We need to make sure we incorporate fair labour standards into all stages of the textile supply chain. Now, a significant challenge to making a change to a sustainable industry, in our view, comes from the opaque nature of the apparel supply chain. Now, at the top of this slide, we show a schematic of the supply chain. The apparel brands, which we all know and shop in, are those doing the retail in the square towards the right there. Now, above those and supplying them are a series of tiers, starting at tier 1 with the final garment production, tier 2 where the fabric is manufactured, tier 3 where the fibers are made, and all the way back to tier 4, the actual raw material manufacturer. And at each stage here, we indicate some of the major negative environmental impacts. So, for instance, raw material manufacture can be associated with significant water use. For instance, cotton is a very thirsty plant. It's also obviously associated with pesticide use in many cases. But each of these different nodes, if you like, of the supply chain has issues associated with it. Now, currently, the apparel industry is typically characterized by little in the way of vertical integration. Retail brands don't typically own their entire supply chain, but they are where most of the value, that's capital, sales, profits, are occurring within the supply chain, but it's not necessarily where the environmental impact sits. The apparel brands sitting at the retail node, the ones that we deal with, typically have limited visibility of their supply chain. They will know their tier 1 suppliers, those producing the finished garments. They're the guys that they're going to be actually buying the garment that they sell to us from. But visibility into the fabric manufacturers, the fiber producers, and especially into raw material production is often highly lacking. And I'd note that even at tier 1, the fact that you will sometimes see subcontracting of manufacturing can mean a brand doesn't actually know everyone who is providing or working on their finished garments. Now, the lack of visibility in the supply chain makes it difficult to drive change. As this quote from Peter Drucker, the management theorist, states, if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. Without real knowledge of what impacts are happening in the supply chain, where they're happening, and why they are happening, it's likely impossible to make the sort of radical change to the apparel industry needed to move to a more sustainable footing. Currently, do brands, consumers of textiles, regulators, or investors in the industry know what is happening upstream of retail? Too often the answer is no. Brands may be switching their stores to renewable energy, cutting down on the plastic packaging they use when they sell us goods. That's fantastic. It's a positive that we're seeing that. But the truly systemic change needed for a sustainable textile industry requires significant action all along the value chain, and that change needs to happen now. Now, we believe the problem of a lack of knowledge about what's happening in the supply chain can be in part addressed by improvements in traceability and transparency. So what do we mean by those terms? Firstly, traceability. Traceability is the ability to track the history of a product from the raw materials through the stages of processing and manufacturing all the way to sale. Now, in the future, it may be that we'll be tracking it beyond the point of sale. We'll be using labeling, embedded tagging that will allow the garment to continue to be monitored, tracked, if you like, through multiple users and at its end of life to ease its recycling. But at the moment, traceability, we're mainly focusing on raw materials through to the point of sale. Tracking can begin with the fiber and follow it all the way through all the processing steps until it reaches into a final produced garment. Data collected would include what has been done as the item moves through the value chain, by who and where, what processes were used, what chemicals were used. This allows the individual product's environmental footprint to start to be considered. Once you have the data flowing in from traceability systems, the question is what you do with it. Transparency is the process of making the data relevant and usable to the value chain. This data can be used to pinpoint areas for change, for instance, how a fiber is being processed by a supplier, and also provides a warning system. So it may throw a light on previously unknown problems, such as maybe a subcontractor not meeting local labour laws. Data can also be shared externally to the value chain, for instance, with civil society, with investors. An example is brands who publicly list their manufacturing partners for instance, on their websites. But why aren't brands implementing traceability already? Well, in our discussions, we've come to sort of three major areas as to what are proven roadblocks to more traceability systems. Firstly, it requires cooperation across the supply chain. This can be hard to achieve if relationships between players are not strong and there is not mutual trust. For instance, the supplier might not want to provide full traceability of their relationships to a brand because they'll fear being disintermediated. They'll worry the brand might say, okay, we'll stop dealing with you. We'll go straight to who you're getting your stuff from and sort of cut you out completely. This is a big issue for a sort of systemic change the industry needs, which requires that work all the way across the value chain. Secondly, historically, I think traceability has been seen as costly and difficult to do. There was a belief that the payoffs were just not sufficient to justify the time and investment required. Retail brands tend to often be publicly listed corporations. Management are incentivized to focus on the next quarterly reporting, profit margins and sales growth, and working with suppliers over a number of years, potentially to put in traceability systems and improve environmental impact really wasn't, top of mind. It wasn't thought to be worth the investment. We believe that technological development has now made the process of implementing traceability systems easier and cheaper. And I think therefore this problem should be seen as starting to really not be there anymore. Finally, historically, we'd question whether there's been any pressure for these systems to be created. A need for better data on the sustainability of a product is a relatively new phenomenon. 10 or 15 years ago, did the average apparel brand really care about its sustainability footprint? Some did. I think a lot of the time they didn't. So how do you do traceability? As previously noted, traceability means being able to follow a fiber from field to garment and knowing who did what at each stage of the value chain. Tools for traceability, in our view, can be broadly classified into either digital or physical. Digital systems provide a means to track the movement of a good through the system. Physical systems provide a means of tagging a product as it moves through the supply chain. So, and wrapping around these two pillars that we think are also important is certification and regulation, which can act to help build confidence in the data produced by the tracking and tagging. So sort of guaranteeing that what you're actually putting into your system is worthwhile, it can be trusted. It's not the garbage in, garbage out problem. Now, a range of technologies are available in both the digital and physical space. For instance, the use of blockchain or integrated ordering systems for digital tracking. Tagging technology includes embedding some things like DNA or molecular markers into the fiber, the use of holograms, RFID tags, or QR codes, to name but a few. Many of the technologies I've mentioned have really developed in recent years, along with the ability to manage and make use of the huge quantities of data that traceability systems generate. But we will acknowledge, even with new technology, it's not an overnight process to implement traceability. This isn't something the CFO of a brand can say, right, tomorrow we're going to buy a product and next week we'll know everything that's happening in our supply chain. It'll often take many months, potentially years, to build a complete map of suppliers. And this isn't something you do once. It has to be an organic process. It will remain active. You'll have to continue to monitor as you bring in new suppliers and sign new contracts over time. So where do we stand today in terms of apparel brands implementing traceability systems? Well, various brands have made steps into this space. For instance, H&M has partnered with Textile Genesis to deploy its traceability system with the aim of tracking fibers used in around 200 million garments per year. Levi Strauss collaborated with the R Collective to produce a fully traceable denim collection, which was based on QR codes. However, these interesting examples are very exciting, show the sort of what could happen with the technology, but they remain far from the norm. On this slide, we show data from the annual fashion transparency analysis published by Fashion Revolution. This looks at the 250 biggest apparel retailers and notes what level of traceability they've reported for their supply chain. Now, the positive is that the degree of traceability has increased over over time. So we've got 2022 on the left, going back to 2017 on the right. But it's pretty clear that traceability drops off quite quickly once we move beyond tier 1. While in 2022, close to half of the brands who responded had traceability or knew their tier 1 suppliers, that fell away to 30% for tiers 2 and 3, and was still remained only at around 12% for tier 4. So although this work shows improvement over time, which is a positive in terms of direction of movement, it's clearly still a long way to go. Now, over the next few slides, we'll consider what widespread adoption of traceability systems and subsequent transparency with the collated data means for different stakeholders in the apparel industry, and why we think this can be a win for the industry and stakeholders overall. So starting with consumers. For consumers, we see traceability as a tool to give them greater power to make sustainable choices. Traceability means that brands making green claims can be asked to provide the evidence for their claims. At the moment, if the brand says this is a greener t-shirt, this is a more sustainable t-shirt, what evidence is there? If they don't know what happened to it down in the supply chain, they don't know what chemicals were used, they don't know where the cotton maybe that it's made from was grown, how can they really be making those sort of claims? Is that just greenwashing to the consumer? Giving the consumers or allowing a better sense of data gives the consumers the power to drive change by voting with their money. If you do surveys of consumers, a lot of people will say, I want to buy more sustainably. I want to make sustainable choices when I'm making purchase decisions. If the apparel industry had good data and could really say this is a greener t-shirt, this is a less green choice, we'd really be able to see whether consumers back up their claims with their actions. Let's hope that they would. If traceability and transparency systems were the norm, we also think it would give consumers the opportunities to really interrogate green claims and start to be very savvy in the way they think about things. Start pushing back against a brand who says we are greener or we're claiming this, and say, well, show me the data. And if the data isn't immediately forthcoming, start to think, okay, that's a red flag. What's happening here? Why are they not being as forthcoming maybe as they should be? Then they might move their purchasing decision to a brand that has a more forthcoming nature on data. So it would allow them to shop sustainable and look for those retailers who are really upfront on their sustainability credentials. Importantly, I think traceability also has big benefits for supply chain workers. It can shine light on conditions that they're experiencing in the workplace and help drive out bad actors. I mentioned earlier the idea that it will shine light on potentially people who are not meeting local labour laws, but it can also be because these guys are really on the front line of some of the bad environmental impacts that we see in this industry. So, for instance, reducing the use of toxic chemicals, that will be a benefit in the workplace, less exposure when they're at work. But if that leads to less pollution of the waterboard in the area that the factory is sited, that's a benefit to the community as large. So I think positives both for consumers and supply chain workers. Moving on to looking at the actual actors, the corporates that are involved in the manufacture and retail of apparel, we acknowledge that for supply chain actors, traceability could be a double-edged sword. Touched on this earlier, that it may allow brands to consolidate suppliers or disintermediate some. As I noted earlier, a lack of trust between brands and suppliers could be a big roadblock to the take-up of some of these systems. Now, on the flip side, those supply chain actors who have invested in improving their sustainability credentials should probably welcome traceability, should welcome the fact that brands are starting to really focus on this, because it could allow them to charge a price premium for their more sustainable fiber, more sustainable processes. And we think it's important to note at this point that the brands really should be helping to build the trust with suppliers to get them on board with traceability by working with them as they improve their environmental impacts. This could be via advice, consultancy, it could be direct financing. We've done work looking at how you can get very strong payback on its fairly small investments that drive environmental improvements in the supply chain. Or it could be guarantees for order volumes, so that so supply chain actors have that confidence to invest in capital expenditure to maybe improve processes if they know that they're guaranteed to continue to receive volumes of orders in the future. Now, for retail brands, our research suggests that investing in traceability systems can actually drive an improvement in net profit, something that I'll touch on in more detail on the next slide. But I think it also gives them a couple of other benefits. Firstly, it gives them the knowledge to help them engage with the supply chain and help it drive improvements. We're seeing a lot of the major brands set science-based targets on greenhouse gas emissions, talking a great game on environmental improvement that they want to do and how important sustainability is as part of their sort of corporate mindset. To really do this, to really make a change, they need to know more about what's happening in the manufacture of their product, and traceability is the answer to that conundrum. But I find also think it's really important as they try and demonstrate their green credentials. I talked about the idea that consumers saying, okay, how can you claim this is a greener, more sustainable t-shirt if you don't have the data to back it up? This is an area that we're seeing, I think consumers are going to be increasingly concerned by, but we're also seeing real regulatory pressure moving towards this area. So I think something that brands really need to be on top of if they want to be a leader in sustainable fashion. Now, diving in a little bit more, as I mentioned, on the potential impact of traceability systems for the brands and the fact that we think they can be a positive for their margins overall. Now, we have worked with traceability provider Segura to show the financial upside to introducing better traceability. Segura shared with us their return on investment calculation they share with new customers, and we summarize some of the benefits in this table on this slide. So broadly, implementing traceability systems allows better management of the supply chain, reducing waste and errors, and minimizing unnecessary costs. For instance, we estimate a potential to radically cut air freight use by more cohesive management of the supply chain. This would see a reduction in CO2 emissions, so obviously a benefit on the environmental side, but it's also associated with lower, obviously, cost, and that's positive for margins. Waste and errors can be reduced due to a better audit trail. Issues with quality can be tackled and tracked and remediated more quickly, reducing return rates. And bad actors in the supply chain can be uncovered and removed, reducing the risk of sort of fines and litigation down the road. Overall, our analysis suggested a potential net profit increase from implementing traceability systems for around 3 to 7%, which is a material benefit to the overall industry. So, moving on to what could improved traceability mean for investors in the textile industry? Well, in light of what we discussed on the previous slide and the obvious benefit to profitability, we think that traceability should be a non-negotiable for investors. They should be not accepting any excuses from management teams anymore about monetary cost or the time and effort to actually put traceability in place. We think that irrespective of the potential environmental benefits you can see on the back of traceability system implementation, the profit benefit is enough of a reason to be on board with this investment. Therefore, we call on investors to really engage with corporates to understand the degree of knowledge of their supply chain they have at the moment and push them to really improve that visibility. We also think as investors should be thinking that traceability helps them make a better judgment of the risk of the investments they're making. For instance, they can better understand where a brand is sourcing their apparel from, and thus have a better and more immediate view of the likely impact of disruption, for instance, from a natural disaster, from a geopolitical conflict, whatever it might be. In our view, corporates who continue to resist implementing these systems and sharing the data should be seen as higher risk, and valuations should move to reflect that. Now, what about regulators? Now, knowing brands can understand their supply chain better means regulators can be comfortable in demanding more of them in terms of responsibility for what is happening in those supply chains. And positively, we are already seeing regulators in the EU take a lead on this. And I think this is a really important step. On the 23rd of February 2022, the Commission adopted a proposal called the Directive on Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence. The aim of this directive is to foster a more sustainable and responsible corporate behaviour with a focus on both human rights and environmental considerations within a company's value chain. Corporates will be required to bring to an end, prevent and account for both negative human rights and environmental impacts, both in their own operations, but also in their subsidiaries and their value chains. To be able to meet these requirements, brands are going to need to invest in traceability systems. So bringing all this together, what have we discussed? To become sustainable, the textile industry needs to acknowledge and address the negative social and environmental impacts occurring all along its value chain. Moving away from the linear model we see today, that take, make, dispose model I mentioned earlier, will require radical change. To play its part in preventing catastrophic climate change, the industry needs to act now. Unfortunately, too often the current trend remains towards ever-growing overconsumption. We see traceability as a critical plank in making the transition towards a more sustainable future by throwing light on the previously opaque supply chain. We can't improve what we don't know about, as I quoted earlier. Data on where impacts are occurring can allow targeting of finance and action towards addressing these problems. And truly significant change will often need actors along the value chain or even competitors to work together. We see traceability, which elucidates the responsibility, as important in helping to build trust and relationships, which will be an important foundation for the change that we need to see. Now, our work shows that traceability can provide positive outcomes for many stakeholders all along the value chain. And so we'd conclude by saying the time for excuses is over. We need radical action today, and traceability is a key part of that. So thank you for your time today. As mentioned, if you do have questions about today's presentation, our broader work, or Planet Tracker, please do get in touch via my email, which again is richard@planet-tracker.org. But thank you very much for joining today's presentation.